Hello, and thanks for tuning in for another session of Back Porch Catechetics. This short video is focused on sin in reference to Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1870 to 1876. To get a decent sense of sin, I think we really have to understand human action and think about the kind of object of a human action, or our goal. When we're aiming at something good, then we can achieve it, and that sort of rebounds to us. We know about those cycles of developing good habits. But we might also think of ourselves as aiming at something bad, or aiming at something not good, something wrong. That is, at its essence, a deep biblical understanding of sin, to miss the mark, to fall short. But then we can get confused because we have to think about who sets the goal, or the object, and who defines it. The flip side to this is who is offended when we miss the mark. And it's traditional to think of sin as offending God, or as falling short of a mark God has set for us. We also have a deep sense of human community, and if we fall short of the human community, we often process that as a major missing the mark, also a sin. We sometimes forget that we set our own goals, and when we fall short of those goals, well, that too could register as a sin. So we need to account for three different kinds of objects maybe, or the way that these three are related, and we want to keep a definition of sin broad enough to understand that sin would be an offense against God, an offense against the human community, an offense against ourself. If we miss the mark, that would be the path of sin. The object, or the action which we're going to perform, would be sin. Now, there are other ways of thinking about how we get, kind of from A to B, what's going on in the person to this final achieving of your goal, or this action, this deed, this thought. We've said before that, in general, people have some kind of impulse. And these impulses can come either from, without a totally external source, or they can come from within. And the impulses generally present themselves as having a kind of observation, I am hungry, that's also coded with a therefore I should eat. Or we might say that the impulses have sometimes an action statement or propositional content. I'm attracted to that person, I should speak with him. I'm angry at that person, I should punch her. Right? These different impulses, we'll use the term generically and generously, can either come from within or from without, and that would be sort of a first phase of thinking about a human action or achieving your goal, which ought to be good, but sometimes is not. Well, we know that part of the beauty of being human is that even though we may have very strong impulses, we do actually have a second kind of function, or a second feature, a second aspect, and that would be our reason. Now, different people have different abilities in reason, no doubt about that, but part of being human is to have impulses, and another part of being human is to have some kind of rational faculty, which can in fact think about these impulses. It can decide whether or not it's appropriate to follow that impulse, or whether that impulse is correct. I might think, I'm hungry, eat donuts. And then my reason might say, well, but not that many donuts, or you should not eat donuts right now. Similarly, we have thoughts all the time. I should get up and go do something, but I'm in a meeting, or I'm in a conversation, or something's happening, and so I'll wait, right? There's a sense that reason can tell us whether this impulse is the most efficient way or a helpful way to achieve the good. We also commonly speak of a third aspect of human action, and that's our will. And well, there we know there is a difference between thinking I ought to do something, or thinking this thing is good, and between actually deciding to do it. This shows up sometimes in bad habits, where we might have begun to realize, the impulse to do this is really not good, and I've thought about it, and I realize it's not good, and so I've gotten up to this far, but when I get to whether my will actually engages it, we can find ourselves powerless to choose to change our bad habits. Or sometimes we can find ourselves in such a habit of doing good that it's natural in a way, right? That we just move from a good impulse to a good judgment about it rationally to a good decision to follow it, and we attain the good. All right, sin will happen when any one of these is broken. So we could think of an impulse, for something bad, a desire to do something we should not do. We can think of our reason, our conscience, our judgment, either inappropriately coming to a false conclusion. Sometimes we just make a mistake, like when we're doing those old algebra problems. We quote flip the sign, or we forget a negative or a positive, and that changes the whole meaning of the equation. And we can also think of our reason being poorly formed, where perhaps we've learned to do something poorly. So we might be engaging reason, but our reason is either not fit for the task, or our reason is actually leading in the wrong direction because it has been poorly formed. And similarly, we could have a breakdown at the level of our will, that we could know something is good and yet not want it, not choose it, not select it. Right, so the Catechism points out that when we think of sin, we kind of need to take into account all of these, and a full-fledged sin would be an act which is contrary to reason, and therefore, it's going to cycle back to poorly formed mind or poorly formed understanding. But we could also think of sin as a poorly formed will, or to choose poorly. So we get that language in 1874, that to choose deliberately, that is both knowing it and willing it, is bad. And in fact, this allows us to think about a scale of how sinful and how culpable something is. We might think at first the good at which we're aimed, and if it's a minor, tiny thing, or if it's very mixed, the little quote-unquote white lie, then perhaps that's not really a super deep or super complicated, super significant kind of sin. But what if it's a really good? What if it's something, so profoundly awesome, like the gift of human life, and we're trying to pervert or damage it? Well, then, we might be thinking about a really bad type perversion, a really bad object, if we're thinking we might murder someone. All right, this means then that we want to run sin on a scale, and the traditional language is a mortal sin all the way down to a venial sin. And mortal sin is the super dangerous, the deadly one. And this doesn't mean deadly just in, your life on earth, but deadly in the Christian sense that it would lead to hell. And venial means something like small or light or regular. Sometimes people even refer to them as daily. Not to lessen the impact of the sin as if some sins are okay, but to recognize that maybe if you weren't completely reasonable, then even though you did a thing which was really bad, or you had a bad impulse, you were unable to judge it. We make distinctions like this about small children. They may do something that is in fact not right on any scale, but they didn't know, or perhaps they weren't completely in control of their bodies. It was an accident. And in that way, we would say, well, it was a serious issue. We don't want to take that away. I'm thinking my daughter once scratched me in the eye, but she was just a couple months old. She had no control over her arms and her hands. All right, so a serious thing, but she's not terribly blameworthy about it because she did not quite understand what she was doing and didn't have complete control. She may not have even decided to do it. It may have been a reflex. And in that sense, we might talk about her culpability being further down. That might register as serious damage, but a venial kind of sin for her person. All right, suffice it to say, scale that's going to run from mortal to venial, and that will let us separate things. Notice part of what we're doing here is we're asking, well, was the impulse entirely wrong? Was it aimed at something that just never should have been the focus of your aim? Was the reason entirely wrong? And was the will, fully involved and entirely wrong? If you sort of knowingly and willfully go after something that's not correct, that's not right-headed, that is evil, well, that's talking about a mortal sin. But if we're thinking, well, you had a good intention and you thought it through, but your will kind of broke down at the last minute, then this is how we might start to think about understanding the sin as less culpable, or in essence as venial. There are other things where we might want to say, how big is the X, how grave is the matter. We'll speak about that. And then, we might have a different scale where we're talking about, it was a super grave matter, but you didn't really understand it. You understood it poorly, and so it's a smaller bit. I simply want to point out at the basic level, we can see that we're analyzing each particular faculty within human existence, and we might be talking about the scale or the degree of involvement of each one of these. And this is why the Catechism speaks of a venial sin, which is a disorder, but it's repairable by charity, it's repairable by appeal to a number of sacraments, and why it speaks of mortal sin as being grave, very dangerous, and mortal sin typically involves the specific sacrament of penance, confession, reconciliation, in order to heal and come back. Right, I think this is a basic overview of those parts. Let's return again to think about what it means to offend God, to offend the human community, and to offend the self. Because there's an implicit argument in the understanding of sin that these three are actually related. In other words, to offend God, to offend the human community, to offend the self, these are all mutually entailing. So, we might start by thinking of a very public sin which is prohibited in the eternal law, like murdering someone, right? One of the 10 Commandments says, thou shalt not murder. And, it's clear that that would be to damage God's creation. If I murder or try to murder someone else, then I'm trying to do profound damage to someone that God has created. And that would be to offend God. It's obvious why that's an offense against the human community. I mean, the human community is essentially other persons, right? So if I'm trying to harm another person, then that would go against that other person. Sometimes it's not clear how we're doing damage to ourselves and hurting another person, but think about the guilt, think about all of the baggage that comes with knowing that you've done damage or done wrong to someone else. Even if you feel you were justified, or you had thought about it, or even if you feel like it was an accident, there's still a lot held over in your own soul, which shows that you've done some damage to yourself. Right, I think it's easy to see how all three of those might be related, even if from slightly different perspectives or angles. If we take another sin, like a perfectly private sin, one that we do and it seems like nobody else knows, and something we do in our own room or something, and there you have it. How does that seem to affect other people? Sometimes we get confused trying to go the other direction. And it's helpful to think about, illnesses. There's lots of talk these days about respiratory illnesses and the way that we might spread contagion to someone else. And part of what we're realizing is, I do not have to know consciously that you are sick in order to contract a disease from you. It does not have to be apparent. There can be hidden pathogens. There can be tiny little ways that something wrong with you. You may not even need to know that you are sick in order to pass some kind of disease or illness along to me. All right, so even if we're doing something in total private and it's never stated explicitly, no one ever knows, it still seems entirely possible that something which brought you down in the tiniest bit could bring down the rest of the human community. And of course, that could also be an offense against God, again, even if other people don't know. All right, part of why we want to talk about these different elements, talk about the impulses, the reason, the will, the final object, how these are related, and why we want to talk about the three different kind of relationships which are broken, is that when we think of sin, we also need to think of how it's healed, because Christianity has definite insight into healing these kinds of things. In fact, the whole purpose of the church is to reconcile sinners, is to bring God's grace. to give absolution and to reconcile sinners. And part of the sacramental structure of the church is that you need to confess your sins to God, and you need grace to restore whatever has been lost in that relationship. But you also need a way to express your sorrow and your contrition to the human community. And that can be done particularly in the sacramental structure through the person of the priest, who can represent God and who can represent the rest of the human community and assure you that you are returning to your right relationship with both God and with the rest of humanity. We also need to often verbalize things out loud for our own selves. I think that's a basic psychological understanding. And verbalizing things, expressing things to another person very much helps us in that return to ourself. We might also need a mature guide, someone else who can see clearly, or at least more clearly than we can, how we need to return to ourselves. Someone who can say, you have made a mistake, but you are not your mistakes. You have been abused, but you are not simply limited by your abuses. And in that sense, someone else can really help steer us, help author us, help us get back to the right path. Right? We also realize then that we need grace, and we need grace to heal and fix impulses which are broken, and we need grace to heal and to fix reason, our mind, which may be poorly formed or may not work appropriately, may make some mistakes, and we need grace to fix our will. So a basic understanding of sin in these different ways also helps us see the healing for sin where grace will come. That means then that this basic diagram has shown us kind of a scale, how we might think of severity or gravity of sin. It's shown us different ways in which it might break down, and therefore different ways in which God can heal us. And it's shown us different relationships or elements which are involved in missing the mark, in sinning, and then also how those can be restored. One more point about sin is made in the end of this section, 1876. The repetition of sins, even venial ones, engenders vices, among which are the capital sins. All right, so there's the sense that even if I'm aimed at a tiny little venial sin here, and I've only, broken one little part, bad impulse, one tiny little reason, one tiny little bad choice, right? Well, the fact is that human actions circle back on us. Like, if we've done it once, we might do it again. It'll get easier. And however you want to think of this, there's a rut which is eroded, and the more water runs down it, the bigger the rut gets. There are synapses in your brain that become faster. They work more efficiently. And we do something, before long, that something becomes a habit. And once it's a habit, that can completely eradicate the will. That can rewrite our learning. And that can give us very strong impulses that are aimed at something we really do not want for ourselves, but they sort of take over. And so there's this sense that even venial sins, when repeated, can lead to vice. And then we're in a vicious cycle. And a vicious cycle can very quickly be a mortal sin. This gives us some insight into why we must keep careful watch over all of these elements, or why we might want to think about our sins from multiple angles. Well, thanks for tuning in for this session, and I'll invite you to make use of all of the graces available to heal where sin and sinfulness have begun to destroy you.